thank you so much for giving up your time, Liz, to be part of this interview for Medics Voices. Can we start with your early life? And do you have any childhood memories that perhaps give insight into what your future career would involve, perhaps?
I was quite ill when I was 11, 12 years old, um, and had a 2 week stay in hospital. And I think that's probably where the seed was sown. Um, and, wanting to become a nurse, I didn't really think about it again. I went to state comp and I live in Leicester, which is the heart of the knitwear industry. You either went, if you didn't do well at school, you went into the hosiery industry. And if you did reasonably well, you went into admin, office work kind of thing. Um, Only a handful of people stayed on and did A levels, and none of my friends did. I stayed on for a year, um, was lonely and left, and ended up working in the office of a knitwear factory, which would just be very typical for my era and my peer group. And somebody just said to me one day, you know, what do you see yourself doing? I said, well, I've always wanted to be a nurse. But there was, in those days, people didn't really guide you, did they? And I was very fortunate. It was a GP, actually. A GP. My dad had a shop. I used to help my dad out at the weekends. A GP was a customer. He came in and he said, what are you going to do with yourself? And I said, I want to be a nurse. And he came back in the next Saturday and said, I've arranged for you to go to the School of Nursing to look round. That
So
was it.
completely organic and
Yeah.
opportunistic and
Yeah, a really kind uh, doctor who used to pick my dad's brains so much, to help him with his home renovations and so on, and have a coffee, and yeah. And I now live in that village where that GP worked, and he ended up being a bit of an icon. He's no longer with us, but yeah, strange, isn't it?
interesting.
Yes.
And it seems to me that maybe, I mean, maybe it was within you anyway, but that inspired perhaps that leave the ladder down, kindness that you obviously pay forward yourself. And I I guess, is that because you're a certain type of person? How do you see it? Do you think certain type of people go into such professions?
Um, I think those of us that go into healthcare, I think there is a core of us that go in because it feels like a bit of a calling in some way. Um, but I also think there are people who make really good doctors, nurses, physios, and all the rest of it who happen upon it in some way. They don't have that yearning for the years like I did. Um, I always wanted to work. My dad died young of heart disease. My calling was coronary care. I worked in coronary care in my when I trained and when I was newly qualified to get on, you had to have had some ward experience. I only went to respiratory to get 6 months ward experience so I could go back to coronary care and get promoted. And that was it. Never left. Never left. You know, I saw young people. I remember this young guy with, we used to call it idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis back in the day.
Mhm.
He was in his 30s, gasping, absolutely gasping. And in coronary care, it was so much more organised and structured. You could look at the monitors and see some R on T ectopics and think, oh, we better get ready because this guy, and it was so structured and organised. And yet here on this respiratory ward, it was anything but at times. And it was, you know, that was before we had midazolam on the rest trolley, and we could, um,
Mm.
help people in that. Oh, it was awful. Anyway, I never left, and
Mm.
the rest is kind of history. That's how I fell into lung cancer,
Yeah.
because you know a lot of the early, a lot of the money invested into cancer services went into diagnostics and respiratory, and that's how I ended up working in, an opportunity came along, and da,
Yeah.
da, da, da.
And you've grabbed it with both hands, it sounds like. So,
Yeah, do you know? Yeah, I was a ward manager by then. I'd got three little children. I was working shifts, covering 24-hour responsibility, and met Mick Peake, who ended up being lead lung cancer clinician for NHS England, and he came and got a job in Leicester to sort out our lung cancer services, really, because our performance was so poor and his beds were going to go on my ward. I met him and I just went home. I said to my husband, I met the most passionate
Mhm.
consultant and he's really going to turn around lung cancer services. And they've advertised a nurse to work alongside him. It was a sideways move, but it was regular hours, Monday to Friday, with three little children. That was a bit of a blessing. Yeah, and just hung on to his coattails and got wrapped up in all his passion for service redesign and change and we had a great team. We had a great team, uh, the whole diagnostic team were on board. And yeah, yeah, that's how I got involved in lung cancer. Fell into it.
Yeah.
I'm
And
still good at reading an ECG though.
yeah, I bet you are. Better than many GPs, I'm sure. And so, I mean, the lung cancer kind of starting point is common to a lot of people that I have met, who's now, whose main passion now is mesothelioma. Um, Many services kind of provided to people with meso are modified from lung cancer services in a way,
Yes.
rather than having been created by,
Yeah.
from scratch. And I think how I see it is thanks to the charity Meso UK and other, funders, more tailored specialist meso services are happening and being developed. And how do you think that specific meso need varies with lung cancer need? And but also, do you think it means that people with meso, must have tertiary specialist care, or do you think they can be cared for by more generalist providers? That kind of.
Um, yeah, I mean, I just if just taking a step back from just thoracic oncology, but just looking at cancer generally, or if we just look at thoracic oncology, when I first came into lung cancer, you had non-small cell or small cell. There was no recognition of mutations or targeted treatments. And I think as science has moved on, we realise that there are cancers within cancers within cancers, and the more specialist we get in the treatments we have available, and being able to identify what's driving not just a particular cancer, but a particular individual's cancer, then I think it becomes much harder for us as healthcare professionals to help patients navigate healthcare and get the best out of healthcare. So I think that it's driven by patient need to be able to get the very best out of healthcare, and we cannot be experts in everything. We need people to get stuck down a rabbit hole and run with the evidence and to really find these niche treatments. They may only help 3% of people, but if you're in that 3%, so I think generally in cancer, we need to we need to stop trying to deliver healthcare in every NHS trust, every cancer care in every NHS trust, and for rarer cancers, we need to develop and encourage national teams, regional teams, and sometimes national. So national, if we look at peritoneal mesothelioma, we've got a national surgical team in Basingstoke, a national MDT. We've got a nurse dedicated to that patient, and an amazing community of people living with peritoneal disease who actually know they are getting the best support, even if they're not eligible for the treatment because they don't meet the criteria. They haven't got, that their disease is not suitable for the cytoreductive surgery. Knowing you've been reviewed by the best and by the national team, and then you've still got contact for that ongoing support and part of that national community. It means you matter. It means so much to people. You matter, and we've reviewed you. You're getting the very best there is, and that's what we need for every mesothelioma patient. And absolutely, I think that not every patient needs to be managed by a specialist centre. Not every patient needs to be managed by a secondary care team.
Mm.
I think some patients can, be managed completely by their GP. But I think, providing, that there's easy access back into either secondary care or a specialist team for just checking, just review.
Mm.
You know, I think that secondary care don't necessarily need to see the patient. They can review patients remotely and then liaise with, GPs or their local team. And so and I think the model that we've is emerging for mesothelioma, we've really established it in Scotland. Scotland has a national MDT, and they've got a clinical trial portfolio, they've got national audit.
Mm.
Um, I think, and it's easier. They have 200 patients a year or thereabout, so it is easier to manage that. But if we could mirror what we've got in Scotland and do it in each cancer alliance, or not, we don't necessarily have to follow the geography of the cancer alliances because there are some organic regions within cancer care, then I think that I think if we achieve that in meso and we're along the way to doing that, that could be a model for many other cancers to follow.
Yeah. And the rare, I mean, what struck me, a lot struck me there, but particularly when you said, when patients feel like they matter, I mean, that is essentially
Yeah,
all any of us are trying to
yeah.
achieve, really. And that, when you're involved so closely, professionally, personally, whatever, with a rare condition like meso, um, you have that label, and you're almost on the back foot from the off in a lot of different contexts, particularly saying, applying for funding for research or things like that. How do you cope with that? Maybe how do you keep going
I
when?
cope. I cope. My coping mechanisms have deteriorated the more time's gone on, if I'm honest. I get really emotional sometimes. And I think, I was in my 30s when I started Meso UK, and I was full of optimism. And I thought, oh, this is so obvious. This is such a preventable disease. Um, and it's such a this is such an obvious area for healthcare to focus on and sort out because this shouldn't be happening at all. And now, 20 plus years on, I just think in that time, probably nearly 50,000 people have died in the UK of mesothelioma in that time. And I'm now looking after people that were exposed after we started Meso UK. And that can't be right.
Mm.
That cannot be right. So I do struggle. I do struggle with it actually. I some I've been in London recently and found myself staring at Westminster thinking, come on, wake up. Because Sir Keir Starmer in his opening speech at the party conference said there'll never be a Hillsborough or a Grenfell on our watch. Never be. And I just think, well, let me tell you, 27 times Hillsborough
Yeah.
is happening every year on your watch because 2,700 people are being diagnosed and Hillsborough was what, 97 people. So I do struggle really. Why there isn't a national research program and a national task force for looking at all of the issues around mesothelioma and asbestos disease generally, if I'm honest.
Mm.
I think we're very dedicated to the NHS and making the NHS the best it can be for people with meso. So for us, it's about why is it left to a charity to fund nurses that specialise in this avoidable, despicable cancer? Why haven't we got a national clinical audit? Because if we're not measuring it, we can't improve it. So there should be an audit. Why have we not got funding for specialist networks and MDTs?
Mhm.
Why isn't there money for research? That's Meso UK's, but also we're responsible for giving voice to patients, I feel, because the nature of the disease means they lose their voice.
Mhm.
They're not around for long enough. And so raising awareness and uh, challenging the current management of asbestos regulations, I think, we have a responsibility to help the other organisations that are doing that because we should be preventing this. I mean, my background, I said my background was respiratory, so I got coronary care and then I clicked into respiratory, but I did quite a lot of post basic qualification specialist respiratory courses
Mhm.
And, I did my master's degree in palliative care. So, I think I'm a pretty good all-rounded respiratory nurse who's
Mm.
worked at quite a senior clinical level. Do you know, I've never had any training in asbestos and the diseases it causes.
Mm.
And yet our country has the highest incidence. And I've worked in one of the biggest respiratory units in the country. So that's a basic thing. Every medical and nursing school in the country should be doing smoking cessation, and they should be doing cancer prevention, and they should be doing asbestos diseases.
Do you think in some way, I mean, the word shame just came into my mind there. Do you think in some way that's how society shame, because this just should not be happening? Is that how it's manifesting? And we're kind of almost, oh, just don't talk about it. Don't, because I agree with you. I think one slide and one lecture in 1 week of respiratory at medical school for me was where I was introduced to meso, and then encountered meso patients in my house officer years, which sparked the fire. But it's just not something that we. It's almost okay that doctors or nurses or whoever say, "Oh, well, that's really rare. I don't know about that,"
Yeah.
and it's almost permissible that, well, you wouldn't be allowed to say that about anything else, you know.
No, no, you wouldn't. And for the patient, you wouldn't be allowed to say that about breast cancer or bowel cancer or lung cancer. Um, but for the patient, because I try to always turn it around to what, from their perspective, you know, that's just that's just a tragedy, isn't it? And I think as a healthcare, I think as a healthcare professional, it's absolutely fine to say, I really don't know a lot about this disease. However, I know there are national centres of expertise,
Yes.
and I'm going to refer you to one of those. And I'm going to see you next week to make sure you've heard from them. You know what I mean? To just
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, connect all those dots up. Whereas I think for a vast majority of patients who do find expert centres, they have self-navigated that quite a bit.
Mm.
They are still self-navigating that, um, and that makes me sad. Really, it makes me sad because I am a glass half full person, and we have some amazing clinical teams, and people, GPs doing research in meso. I mean, where else does that happen? So we've got some amazing clinical trials, amazing clinical teams. Um, our asbestos management industry in this country is absolutely amazing. And other countries that have a desire to address their asbestos presence have no expertise and no industry to deal with it. They're really but we have all that. So, we have so many of the requirements to address this in a really comprehensive way, but nobody leading that. And the only people that can lead it are the people in power.
Yeah. And when you set up the charity in,
Yeah.
just as you did, set up a charity, um, I mean, since then it's established itself, Meso UK, as an integral part of the NHS and the way that the NHS cares for people with mesothelioma. Obviously, along with other funding partners, Meso UK funds the majority of clinical nurse specialist posts. Is that the mechanism through which it's managed to integrate into the NHS? And if so,
Yeah,
how does
it's
that come
funny. I
about?
mean, we belong to an organisation called Cancer 52. Cancer 52 being that 52% of people are diagnosed with a rare and less common cancer.
Mhm.
Uh, and so it's all of the charities involved in those rare and less common cancers. And there's over, 120 odd members, different charities. And I've actually spoken to people who run some of the big, like top four cancer charities. And I know that is a unique selling point for Meso UK. We are so embedded in the NHS and so immersed in the front door of the NHS for people with meso, and other charities really struggle to get that
Mm.
traction with the NHS. I think it's because, you know, not many of the cancer charities have a CEO that is a nurse working in the NHS. Um, our board is very NHS strong, and we also have amazing, not just day-to-day supporting patients, but formal connectivity. So we have a very strong patient panel for our research centre, for instance. We have patients sitting on our board. So I think, it'll be interesting to see when I roll over and move, have to hand over the reins, um, how much having a nurse as a CEO who still practices as a nurse, how much, I'd like to think that we've put in the measures and we are established enough that that will be sustained, because it is really important, I think, because we genuinely want to help our healthcare professional colleagues up and down the country to do, because we know they want to, everyone, we don't enter healthcare we want to do our best for the people in front of us, but we just want to make it easier for them to do that. So I hope we've done enough to sustain it, um, because it definitely does make a difference.